This changes everything. King Charles has just made a move that nobody saw coming. A move so bold, so unprecedented that it sent shockwaves through the European Union and thrown British politics into absolute chaos. We're talking about a constitutional earthquake, the kind of moment that only happens once in a generation, and it's happening right now. The EU is in panic mode. Keir Starmer's government is teetering on the edge of collapse, and Nigel Farage, he's right in the middle of it all, and what he's saying will blow your mind. The mainstream media is scrambling to control the narrative, but the truth is spreading too fast for them to contain. This isn't speculation. This isn't rumour. This is real. This is happening. And the implications are absolutely staggering. What you're about to hear will change how you see British politics, the monarchy, and Britain's relationship with Europe forever. The establishment is terrified. The globalists are furious. And the British people, they're about to witness something extraordinary. Pay attention, because what happens in the next few days could determine the future of this nation for decades to come. Let's start with what actually happened, because the details are absolutely explosive. King Charles, who until now has been careful to stay above politics, who has followed the traditional constitutional role of the monarch, has just done something that breaks every rule in the book. In a private meeting that was supposed to be routine protocol, King Charles reportedly confronted European Union officials about Britain's ongoing entanglement with EU regulations. But this wasn't a polite discussion. According to leaked sources from inside that meeting, the King made it crystal clear that he believes Britain's sovereignty is being undermined, that the Brexit the British people voted for hasn't actually been delivered, that EU interference in British affairs is unacceptable and unsustainable. The EU officials were reportedly stunned into silence. They weren't expecting this. Nobody was expecting this. Now, you have to understand the significance of what's happening here. The British monarchy is supposed to be politically neutral. Kings and queens don't take sides. They don't wade into controversial issues. They smile, wave, cut ribbons, and stay out of the messy business of actual governance. That's been the arrangement for over a century. But King Charles has apparently decided that some things are more important than convention, that when he sees his country being sold out, when he sees the will of the people being ignored, when he sees British sovereignty being eroded piece by piece, he has a duty to speak up. And speak up he did, in terms that left no room for misinterpretation, in language that was direct, forceful, and utterly unprecedented for a modern British monarch. The leaked details from this meeting are still emerging, but what we know so far is damning for the EU and for Starmer's government. King Charles apparently raised specific examples of EU overreach, regulations that Britain is still following despite having left the EU, trade rules that favour European interests over British ones, immigration policies that undermine British border control, financial regulations that hurt British businesses. He went through them systematically, one by one, building a case that Britain is still effectively under EU control in many areas that matter. And then he asked the question that nobody in power wants to answer. If Britain has left the EU, why are we still following their rules? Why are British citizens still subject to decisions made in Brussels? Why did 17.4 million people vote for Brexit if nothing has actually changed? The EU officials tried to defend themselves. They talked about international cooperation, about shared standards, about the complexity of disentangling decades of integration, the same excuses and justifications that we've heard for years. But King Charles wasn't having it. He reportedly cut them off and said something that's now being whispered in political circles across Europe. He said that the British people were promised sovereignty and they were betrayed. That Brexit was supposed to mean taking back control, but control has been handed right back to Brussels through the back door. That this betrayal of the democratic will of the people is unacceptable and cannot continue. The room went silent, because when the King of England tells you that you're undermining British democracy, you can't just brush that aside. You can't spin that away. That's a constitutional crisis in the making. But here's where it gets even more interesting, because King Charles didn't stop with the EU officials. He reportedly then turned his attention to the British government representatives who were in that meeting, and he asked them directly why they're allowing this to happen, why they're not defending British interests more aggressively, why they're not honouring the Brexit mandate that the people gave them. The government officials were caught completely off guard. They stammered. They offered weak explanations about diplomatic relations and economic realities. But Charles pushed back. He made it clear that he expects the British government to put Britain first, to stop prioritising the feelings of EU bureaucrats over the needs of British citizens, to actually deliver the Brexit that was promised. Now, word of this meeting reached Downing Street almost immediately. And Keir Starmer is reportedly furious, absolutely livid, because this puts him in an impossible position. If he defends the EU against the king, he looks like he's siding with foreign powers over the British crown. If he agrees with the king, he has to admit that his government has failed to deliver Brexit and is still letting the EU dictate terms. Either way, he loses. Either way, he's exposed as weak, ineffective, and more concerned with pleasing Brussels than serving Britain. His advisors are in crisis mode, trying to figure out how to respond to this, trying to find a way to spin it that doesn't make Starmer look completely pathetic. And they're failing, because there is no good spin here. The king just called out the government and the EU, and everyone knows it. The timing of this couldn't be worse for Starmer. He's already reeling from being booed outside Downing Street. His approval ratings are in free fall. His own party is questioning his leadership, and now the king has effectively undermined his entire approach to EU relations. Because Starmer's strategy has been to quietly rebuild ties with the EU, to soften Brexit, to bring Britain back into closer alignment with European rules and regulations. He thought he could do this gradually, under the radar, without most people noticing. But King Charles just blew that strategy wide open. He's exposed what Starmer has been doing. He's forced the issue into the open, and now Starmer has to defend policies that the majority of the British public opposes. He has to explain why he's undoing Brexit when people voted for Brexit, and he has no good answers, none at all. The constitutional implications of all this are staggering, because the monarch isn't supposed to interfere in politics. But what happens when the government is clearly acting against the democratic will of the people? What happens when politicians are betraying the mandate they were given? Does the king have a duty to step in? Does he have an obligation to defend the sovereignty and democratic rights of his subjects? These are questions that constitutional scholars will debate for years. But in the immediate term, what matters is that King Charles has thrown down the gauntlet. He's made his position clear, and he's put enormous pressure on Starmer's government to change course. The question is, will they, or will this escalate into a full-blown constitutional crisis between the Crown and the government? Either way, British politics has just been turned upside down. And then there's Nigel Farage, because of course Nigel Farage is involved in this. The man who led the Brexit movement, who has been warning for years that Brexit was being betrayed, who has been calling out the government for its continued subservience to the EU, suddenly finds himself vindicated, and he's not staying quiet about it. Within hours of the news breaking about King Charles's intervention, Farage was giving interviews, posting on social media, making his voice heard, and what he's saying is electrifying his supporters and terrifying the establishment. He's calling this a watershed moment, a turning point where the mask has been ripped off and everyone can see the truth, that Brexit was stolen from the British people, and now even the king recognises it. Farage has been tactical in his response. He's not attacking the king. Far from it. He's praising King Charles for having the courage to speak truth to power, for recognising what millions of ordinary Brits already know. That they were promised one thing and given another, that their democratic vote was respected in words but ignored in practice, that the political establishment never really accepted Brexit and has been working to undermine it from day one. Farage is framing King Charles as a defender of democracy, as someone who cares more about the will of the people than about pleasing the EU bureaucrats and the globalist elite. And that framing is resonating. It's resonating hard because people are tired of being lied to. They're tired of politicians who say one thing and do another. And seeing the king stand up for Brexit, for sovereignty, for the democratic mandate. It's giving them hope that maybe, just maybe, things can actually change. But Farage isn't stopping at praise for the king. He's using this moment to launch a full-scale attack on Starmer's government. He's calling for Starmer to resign. He's demanding a general election. He's saying that if the government won't honour the Brexit vote, if they won't put Britain first, then they have no right to govern. And he's rallying his supporters to put pressure on MPS, to protest, to make their voices heard. The Reform UK party, which Farage leads, is seeing a surge in support. Polls taken in just the last 24 hours show Reform gaining ground dramatically. People who were disillusioned, who felt like there was no point in voting because all politicians are the same, are suddenly energised again. They're seeing that there's still a fight to be had, that Brexit isn't dead, that British sovereignty can still be defended. Farage is also making a broader argument about what this means for democracy. He's pointing out that if the government can ignore the biggest democratic vote in British history, if they can pretend to implement Brexit while actually keeping Britain tied to the EU, then what's the point of voting at all? What's the point of democracy if the elite just do whatever they want, regardless of what the people decide? This is a powerful and dangerous argument. Powerful because it resonates with how millions of people feel. Dangerous because when people lose faith in democratic processes, when they believe the system is rigged and their votes don't matter, that's when societies become unstable. That's when extremism flourishes. That's when things can go very wrong very quickly. And Farage knows this. He's using it. He's channeling that frustration and anger into political momentum. The establishment is absolutely panicking about Farage's response because they thought they'd neutralised him. They thought Brexit was settled, that people had moved on, that Farage was yesterday's news. But King Charles's intervention has given Farage new ammunition and new relevance. He's back in the spotlight. He's back on every news channel. He's back at the centre of the national conversation. And he's using this platform to devastating effect. He's not just attacking Starmer. He's attacking the entire political class, Conservative and Labour alike. He's saying they're all complicit in the Brexit betrayal, that they all put their own interests and their relationships with European elites ahead of the interests of the British people. And that message is landing. People are listening. People are angry. And that anger is being directed exactly where Farage wants it directed. There are rumours, unconfirmed but persistent, that Farage has been in contact with people close to King Charles, that this intervention by the king didn't come out of nowhere, that there's been communication, coordination even, between Brexiteers and royal circles. Now, we have to be careful about this. We can't confirm it, and it would be highly controversial if true. But think about it. King Charles has always been more politically engaged than his mother. He's known to have strong views on various issues, and he's watched as Brexit, something that a majority of his subjects voted for, has been systematically undermined. Would it be so surprising if he'd been listening to people like Farage, if he'd been influenced by arguments about sovereignty and democracy, if he'd decided that constitutional convention had to take a back seat to defending the democratic will of the people? It's speculation, but it's plausible speculation. And if true, it means this is even bigger than we thought. What's clear is that Farage sees an opportunity here, a massive opportunity. He's positioning himself and Reform UK as the only party that will truly deliver Brexit, the only party that will stand up to the EU, the only party that puts Britain first without apology or hesitation. And with the king having essentially validated the core Brexit argument, with Starmer's government in disarray, with public anger at boiling point, Farage might actually be right that this is his moment. The next general election could see Reform UK making massive gains, could see the political landscape of Britain completely transformed, could see the establishment parties that have dominated for decades finally facing real consequences for their failures and betrayals. And all of it traces back to this moment, to King Charles deciding he'd had enough. to the king doing what politicians wouldn't do, actually standing up for the people who voted for Brexit and never got it. The international reaction has been swift and predictable. The EU is furious. EU officials are talking about King Charles interfering in matters that aren't his concern. They're claiming he's overstepping his constitutional role. They're demanding that the British government rein him in. But here's the problem with that. The king is the king. He doesn't answer to the EU. He doesn't answer to Brussels bureaucrats. And telling the British government to control their monarch is about the most tone-deaf thing the EU could do. It just reinforces the exact argument that Brexiteers have been making for years. That the EU thinks it can boss Britain around. That they have no respect for British sovereignty or British institutions. The EU's reaction is actually helping Farage and the Brexit cause. They're proving the point. They're showing everyone that they believe they should have power over Britain. And the British people are seeing this and they're disgusted by it. Now let's talk about what this means for the future. Because we're at a genuine crossroads. The path Britain takes from this moment could determine the country's direction for generations. On one side, you have Starmer and the establishment trying desperately to maintain the status quo, to keep Britain tied to the EU in all but name, to pretend Brexit happened while making sure nothing really changed. They'll spin this King Charles intervention as an aberration, as something to be ignored or explained away. They'll try to pressure the palace to walk it back, to issue some kind of clarifying statement that softens the impact. They'll use every tool at their disposal, every media contact, every establishment connection to minimise the damage and return to business as usual, because that's what they do. That's all they know how to do. But on the other side, you have a growing movement of people who are absolutely done with being lied to, who see what King Charles did as a beacon of hope, who are rallying behind Farage and anyone else willing to actually fight for Brexit and British sovereignty. These people aren't going away. They're not going to be placated by promises or calmed by spin. They want action. They want results. They want to see the EU's grip on Britain broken once and for all. And they now have the king, intentionally or not, as a symbolic figurehead for their cause. That's powerful. That's dangerous for the establishment, because you can dismiss Nigel Farage as a politician. You can attack him, smear him, try to delegitimise him, but you can't do that to the king. He's above that kind of political warfare, and his intervention carries a weight that no politician's words ever could. The pressure on Starmer is now immense. He's being squeezed from all sides. His own Labour Party has pro-EU factions that want to move closer to Brussels, but he also has working class constituencies that voted heavily for Brexit and are furious that it hasn't been delivered. He has the king essentially saying his government is failing to defend British sovereignty. He has Farage and Reform UK attacking him daily. He has the public booing him in the streets. He has his approval ratings collapsing. Something has to give. Either Starmer changes course dramatically or his government falls. There's no middle ground anymore. King Charles has made sure of that by forcing this issue into the open. The days of quietly betraying Brexit while hoping nobody notices are over. There's also the question of what happens next with King Charles himself. Will he continue to speak out on this issue? Will he make public statements that go even further? Or will he be pressured to retreat, to go back to the traditional silent role of the monarch? The palace is in a difficult position. On one hand, they understand that the king overstepped traditional boundaries. On the other hand, the public reaction to his intervention has been overwhelmingly positive among a large segment of the population. People are praising him for standing up for Brexit, for showing courage, for caring about democracy. If the palace forces him to back down, it could create a backlash. It could make him look weak, controlled by politicians. But if he continues, it could trigger a constitutional crisis between the monarchy and the elected government. What's fascinating is watching the different factions within British society react to this. The working class, the people who voted for Brexit in huge numbers, are largely supportive of King Charles. They see him as finally someone in power who gets it, who understands their concerns, who's willing to stand up for what they voted for. The metropolitan elite, the Remainers, the people who never accepted Brexit are horrified. They're talking about the king becoming political, about him undermining democracy. The irony is rich because these are the same people who've spent years trying to overturn or undermine a democratic vote they didn't like, but now they're clutching their pearls about constitutional norms and the separation of powers. It's transparent and pathetic, and most people can see right through it. The media is divided as well. The Guardian, The Independent, the BBC, they're all running pieces about how dangerous this is, how the king has overstepped, how this threatens constitutional stability. But the Telegraph, the Express, the Sun, they're running stories that portray King Charles as a hero, as someone who's defending British sovereignty when politicians won't. The narrative battle is fierce. But here's what matters. The people who actually read The Guardian and The Independent were never going to support Brexit or Farage anyway. They're the committed Remainers, the establishment loyalists. But the people who read The Sun and The Express, the working class voters who swung Brexit and who decide elections, they're getting a very different message. They're being told that the king is on their side. And that's going to have political consequences. We're also seeing this play out in surprising ways internationally. In other European countries that have Eurosceptic movements, people are watching what's happening in Britain with great interest. Marine Le Pen in France has already commented, praising King Charles and saying it shows that even British royalty understands the EU is a threat to national sovereignty. Giorgia Meloni in Italy, Viktor Orban in Hungary, they're all watching this. Because if Britain can break free from the EU fully, if Brexit can actually be completed despite all the resistance, it sets a precedent. It shows that it's possible. It encourages other countries to push back against Brussels. The EU knows this. That's why they're so panicked. King Charles hasn't just threatened British-EU relations, he's threatened the entire European project by showing that resistance is possible and can come from the highest levels. The economic angle is also significant. Uncertainty about Britain's relationship with the EU affects markets, affects investment, affects the pound. We've already seen some volatility in response to this news. Traders don't know what to make of it. Is this going to lead to a cleaner break with the EU? Is it going to lead to political chaos? Is it going to lead to a government collapse and new elections? All of these possibilities affect economic calculations. And while market volatility is concerning in the short term, in the long term, what Britain needs is clarity. People and businesses need to know what the rules are, what Britain's relationship with the EU actually is. And if King Charles's intervention forces that clarity, if it forces a definitive resolution one way or the other, that could actually be economically beneficial. The worst thing for the economy is endless uncertainty and ambiguity, which is exactly what we've had for years. Maybe this is the push needed to finally resolve it. So where does this all lead? What happens next in this extraordinary situation? Because we're in uncharted territory here, there's no playbook for what to do when the king decides to involve himself in the most contentious political issue of the generation. The constitutional experts are divided. Some say King Charles has violated the fundamental principle of constitutional monarchy and must be reined in. Others say that when the government is clearly subverting the democratic will of the people, the monarch has not just a right, but a duty to intervene. Both sides have arguments. Both sides can cite precedent or lack thereof. What's clear is that this can't just be ignored. Something has to happen, someone has to give, and that's going to reshape British politics. The most likely scenario in the short term is that there will be intense negotiations behind closed doors between the palace and Downing Street. Between the king and the prime minister, they'll try to find some way to diffuse this without it exploding into a full constitutional crisis. Starmer will probably try to get King Charles to issue some kind of statement saying he was misunderstood, that he has full confidence in the government, something like that. But will King Charles agree to that? Will he be willing to back down and make himself look weak, or will he double down? Because if King Charles has decided that defending British sovereignty and democracy is more important than constitutional convention, then he might not be willing to compromise. He might be prepared to push this all the way. And if he does, Starmer is in serious trouble. The pressure for a general election is going to grow. Farage is already calling for it. Conservative MPS are starting to call for it. Even some Labour MPS from Brexit supporting constituencies are quietly suggesting that maybe the government needs a fresh mandate because the last election was fought on very different grounds. Nobody voted for Starmer knowing that he would keep Britain tied to EU regulations. Nobody voted for a government that would betray Brexit. If they had known, would they have voted the same way? Probably not. So there's a legitimate democratic argument that the people should get another say. That they should be able to vote knowing what the real choice is: full Brexit or continued EU alignment, Farage or Starmer, sovereignty or submission. Make the choice clear and let the people decide. If there is a general election, it will be explosive. It will essentially be a second Brexit referendum, but this time with even higher stakes, because now it's not just about leaving the EU. It's about whether Britain actually left or whether it was all a sham. It's about that whether democracy works or whether the elite can just ignore votes they don't like. It's about the future of the country. And with King Charles having weighed in, with the monarchy effectively on the side of delivering Brexit, that changes everything. Farage and Reform UK would go into that election with the wind at their backs, with momentum, with a cause that's been validated at the highest level. Could they win? Could Reform UK actually form a government? A few months ago, that would have seemed impossible. Today, it's not impossible. It's unlikely, but it's possible. And that possibility is terrifying the establishment. But even if Reform UK doesn't win outright, they could win enough seats to hold the balance of power, to force whichever party does form a government to actually deliver Brexit, to make EU alignment politically impossible. That would be a victory in itself. That would fundamentally change British politics, because right now both major parties are full of people who never really accepted Brexit, who've been working to undermine it. But if Reform has significant parliamentary power, that game is over. Brexit would have to be delivered. The will of the people would have to be respected. And King Charles would have accomplished, through one intervention, what years of political campaigning couldn't achieve. He would have forced the political class to actually listen to the voters. There's also the personal aspect of this for King Charles. He's elderly. He's been waiting his entire life to be king. And now that he finally is, he's choosing to use that position to make a stand on something he clearly believes matters enormously. Think about that. He could have just enjoyed being king, stuck to the script, avoided controversy, but instead he's risking his reputation, risking a constitutional crisis, risking everything because he believes British sovereignty and democracy are worth fighting for. Whether you agree with him or not, you have to respect that. That's not the action of someone who's playing politics. That's the action of someone who genuinely believes something important is at stake and is willing to sacrifice his own comfort and safety to defend it. The legacy implications are huge. If this leads to Brexit actually being delivered, if it leads to Britain truly becoming an independent sovereign nation again, King Charles will be remembered as the king who saved Brexit, who defended democracy when politicians wouldn't. His reign, which many expected to be short and unremarkable, could instead be defined by this moment of courage. Conversely, if he's forced to back down, if the establishment wins, he could be remembered as the king who tried to do the right thing but was crushed by the system. Either way, this is his defining moment. This is what his reign will be remembered for. And he clearly understands that. He's chosen his hill to die on. And it's a hill that millions of British people care deeply about. For the British people, this is a moment of hope. For the British people, this is a moment of hope mixed with anxiety. Hope because finally someone in power is standing up for what they voted for. Someone is defending their democratic rights. Someone is calling out the betrayal they've watched happen in slow motion for years. But anxiety because they don't know what happens next. Will this lead to real change, or will it just lead to more chaos, more instability, more disappointment? The next few weeks are going to be critical. How Starmer responds, how the EU responds, how Parliament responds, how the public responds. All of it will determine whether this moment leads to genuine change or whether it's just another flash in the pan that ultimately means nothing. But here's what we know for certain. The status quo is broken. The pretense is shattered. Everyone can see now that Brexit was betrayed, that the government has been lying, that British sovereignty is still under threat. King Charles has made sure of that. He's forced this issue into the light where it can't be hidden anymore. And once you've seen the truth, you can't unsee it. The British people have been given a choice now, a real choice. Fight for your sovereignty or accept permanent subjection to EU rule disguised as cooperation. Stand with those who defend democracy or side with those who undermine it. It's that simple, and how the nation responds to this choice will determine everything. The next chapter of British history is being written right now, and King Charles, Keir Starmer and Nigel Farage are the main characters. The British people are watching. The world is watching. And what happens next will echo for generations. This is the moment. This is the fight, and nobody knows how it ends. But everyone knows it matters. Welcome to the most important political crisis Britain has faced in decades.